Us now is the Conservative MP David Davis and Vicky Price, the former joint head of the Government Economic Service. Thank you very much for joining us. Vicky Price, first of all, we've just heard there she's not going to budge on that fiscal deal, on the terms that were agreed. She might talk a little bit about growth, but how are these two figures in France and Germany actually going to really see eye to eye when they're coming from such opposing ends?
Well, of course, Merkel has elections to think about herself, so she's thinking particularly about the electorate. But we've seen already that even in Germany, there is anti-austerity voting going on. And she did lose an election, state election,
a very
quite
key
recently.
election, didn't
Absolutely.
she?
And of course, the thing to remember is that she has those elections, whereas Hollande has just been elected. And he's now arguably the strongest man in Europe. And he can, in fact, if he wants, dictate terms. And I think there is no getting away from the case that, in fact, the voters are saying we can't stand this austerity any longer, and he has to come up with a package. It's not going to be something that says we're abolishing everything that we have agreed in the bailout with any of the countries. But if you really think hard, the fiscal compact itself, which has been sorted out, supposedly, still we have to wait for the Irish to vote, is unenforceable. So the question is, how do they go about finding a different solution that encourages growth in the long term and satisfies some of those very, very upset voters?
So is it time now for Plan B? Austerity looks now to be an isolated plan with what's happening and what's happened in France and with what is happening in Greece.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is, a problem with French. Hollande has got no choice. I mean, he got elected on the premise that they're going to change this strategy.
And is he right?
I think there's a large part in which he's right in terms of the need. How he's going to do it's another matter. If he tries a sort of Keynesian approach, it won't work. But the difference between Germany and France is quite interesting. This morning, Germany had 0.5% growth. France standing still, 0. Why? Because the Germans have got better labour markets, better industrial base, and Hollande has to fix that.
In terms then of what you would like to see done, do you want a big spending stimulus then across Europe? Would you like to see Hollande try and push for that in terms of getting growth?
Well, I think we are going to get something in terms of infrastructure spend, without any doubt. It is entirely possible that we'll move towards project bonds. In other words, raising money and spending it on infrastructure. After all, we already ourselves have committed to putting some extra money into the
and do you agree with that, Dave?
I don't disagree with that. I think actually the time you build infrastructure is when labour is cheap, when you need to employ people. Now is the time.
Do you think now that Greece should, I mean, everyone's saying it's more likely, do you think it is time now for Greece to crash out the euro?
I think it's been a near certainty for nearly a year.
And you'd like to see it?
And I think it's probably in the interest of the Greeks. I mean, what's happening in Greece is a social disaster as well as economic disaster, and we shouldn't forget that.
Yes, but is it in our interest? I mean, we heard the Business Secretary, Vince Cable, warning of a massive impact on Britain if Greece does come out of the euro, particularly on the risk of contagion, that you will then see depositors taking their money out of banks in other countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and that would be a disaster.
This was the argument for early action. I mean, I think the German banks have about 23 billion in Greek bonds. We have about 2 billion. So that's the sort of comparative size of the issue. We should have acted earlier. We should have got a more orderly default and a more orderly exit. We didn't do it, so it's going to get worse. And the longer we wait, the worse it'll get.
But you would still like to see Greece leave?
I'm afraid it's pain now or more pain later.
I don't think so at all. I mean, we've got to remember that the European banking system is in serious trouble right now. And although the European Central Bank has injected loads of cash into the system to avoid a sort of credit crunch, what actually has happened is that the banks have borrowed very cheaply from the ECB, the European Central Bank, and then used the money not to lend to companies, but actually mostly to buy government bonds, which were yielding rather a lot across Europe. So they're now stuck with loads and loads of government debt. The moment there's a Greek exit, if you like, the markets are going to realise that the European banking system is in serious, serious difficulties and are going to start punishing both them and the countries.
And the only question is when. I mean, because it gets worse every year. I mean, Der Spiegel this morning was talking about the Greeks having been subsidised in the last several years by, 35,000 euros per person. That's the attitude in Germany, and it's going to get worse.
But it's an argument against Greece leaving, not for Greece leaving.
Well, no, it isn't. It's an argument that we've got to put Greece back on its own feet, and it can't do that while it's inside the euro. It needs to be 40%. It needs a 40% devaluation to be able to compete.
I heard these figures this morning. Actually, if you just look at wages in Greece and how far they've fallen in the last few years, there's been a massive reduction. In fact, Greece is almost getting back to where it was before in terms of costs, where it was before it joined the euro. So in fact, we've already had that.
Negative growth of 12% of the last few years. How's that evolved?
That is because of the austerity package that has been enforced on it, and that's precisely the point. And what you need to do is actually extend the terms, which will happen automatically anyway, because there is an allowance in the bailout package to say that if there are extreme economic difficulties, fifth year of declining GDP is extreme economic difficulty,
and therefore too little government spending. It really isn't. Greece's problem is it cannot compete. Its whole productive sector is being rendered uncompetitive.
Don't disagree.
But the point is it can't compete because of what Vicky Price is saying, because it's being strangled by its own austerity.
Well, the austerity actually compounds it, but the real core problem is its ability to compete, its private sector ability to compete, and until it comes out of the euro, that will always be a problem.
All right, but let's put Greece, if you like, just slightly to one side. What would be bad for Greece? What about for Britain? Are you saying that the British government should be advocating some sort of default for Greece because it would be better for us? Because surely it wouldn't.
It's quite hard for a Chancellor. Just as you heard this morning, Merkel couldn't talk about the possibility of Greek default. Why? Because she'd instantly cause a run on her banks because of the 23 billion exposure. Chancellors can't go out and talk about those sorts of shutdown operations, but I think we certainly should be planning for a departure, and we certainly shouldn't be funding things which put that departure off and make it worse in the long run.
Well, I mean, it looks as if preparations are being made, doesn't it? I mean, surely that is sensible.
No, people are talking about it. There is a bit of a game going on right now. I mean, of course, most central banks will already have contingency plans on what happens if one country exits the euro. And it may not be just Greece if that were to happen. I suspect there would be others as well. But in reality, there is the Greek government right now, if there is one, in the sense that the Greek parties that haven't quite got properly elected, and that's why we're in a gridlock situation, have been obviously sending the message too that something needs to happen in terms of compromise. There is no way in which there's going to be anything sort of positive happening in the June 17 elections, if there are any, without some sort of agreement that at least the memorandum itself that they have signed will allow a little bit of leeway for them.
Will that really fundamentally change anything? As David Davis says, are we really just, in a way, giving more time to have a smoother transition for Greece to come out, because politically it can't be spoken about, as you have said, that inevitably it will happen? Do you really believe that Greece can be saved, if you like, and can really stay sustainably within the euro?
I think Greece needs to reform, but it's not the only country that needs to reform. Just bear that in mind. I think it can, but it cannot have the debt levels that it has at present carrying on forever. So I think what we're going to see is some default taking place in an orderly fashion, more than what we've seen so far, for Greece to then start again from a different base.
Just finally, before I come to Sally Morgan, actually, did you want to say something in response?
I mean, the sheer size of the pain in Greece, when nobody's imagining here, and I'm afraid it's going to be a major default and a departure at some point. And it's unavoidable, whether we wanted to avoid it or not.
Although the Greeks, of course, in the recent polls have said they would like to stay
within
the euro.
Yeah, but with a whole load of flaky parties. I mean, quite interesting to see the consequence in another 6 months if we haven't seen them leave.
Do you get a sense, I mean, just looking back a little to the government, to Tony Blair's governments, that actually the economic policies that were pursued then by Labour are all coming home to roost? If you think of banking deregulation, the housing boom, the euro, I know obviously Gordon Brown was supported, but Tony Blair was. Are they all coming back now to haunt Tony Blair in that sense?
I think it would be a bit of an exaggeration to say that somehow those governments were responsible for,
but
a major...
Just the issues that were supported all during those years.
But the big thing that happened was the crash in 2008. I mean, that's what's had the major impact.
As a result of partly deregulation and of a housing credit.
Look, there are. I mean, it's clear that some things could have been done differently. But to say it was all the fault of the government of that period, I think is pretty ridiculous.
All right. Well, something pretty ridiculous. I shall go to Mark Lowen in Athens. Mark, we've just been talking about Greece and the likelihood of a default and whether it'll be good or bad for the rest of Europe. What is happening today?
Well, yet more talks are underway, Joe, to try to break the impasse here, to try to fill the power vacuum. The President has summoned the heads of 4 or 5 different parties here to discuss partly his proposal to form a technocratic government, a government of non-political and distinguished personalities, as he puts it. Now, quite what this mandate of this government would be is unclear at this stage. Whether or not it would be accepted by the parties is unclear because, of course, Greece's outgoing Prime Minister, Loukas Papadimos, is an appointed technocrat rather than an elected leader and is pretty much resented by many Greeks here for being that. So they are kind of stepping on thin ice with this. They know that the Greeks may not accept it. if there were to be a technocratic government formed, what would be the government's position on Greece's bailout? Would they try to renegotiate parts of the bailout? Would they turn their back on it? So many questions still, and we still don't know even if a government will be formed. If the talks fail today, Greece would be plunged into fresh elections within 4 weeks, which the polls show could bring in an elected government here that does try to tear up the bailout agreement, and that, according to the EU, could mean that Greece is shown the door to the Eurozone once and for all.
I mean, it sounds pretty chaotic, as it has been since those elections. I mean, are people watching with interest the meeting today between Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel?
I think they are, and many here are putting their hopes on the new French President, Francois Hollande. Remember, President Hollande is very sceptical towards the policy of only austerity. He wants to try to encourage growth and stimulus, which is sort of music to the ears of most Greeks here who say that austerity has brought this country to its knees. We've just had figures out, Joe, that show that for the first quarter this year, the Greek economy shrank by 6.2% compared to last year. People blame austerity for that. And so what Greeks are saying, what many Greeks are now saying, is that the wind of change is beginning to blow from Paris down to Athens, that Angela Merkel's policy, Germany's policy of endless austerity is becoming more isolated. And perhaps if Germany can be persuaded to change policy slightly towards Greece, then maybe the Greeks could work out a way of keeping the bailout but tweaking it in some way. It will be very, very difficult, though. It will be a game of brinkmanship. It will be a battle of wills, really, a game of which side will blink first. And it will involve very tough negotiations in the corridors of power in Brussels, Berlin and Athens in the weeks and months ahead.
All right, Mark Lowen, I'm sure we'll be returning to you in the next few days or so. Just one very final word there in response to what Mark Lowen has said. Just
well,
final
first of all,
word.
I think that the Europeans do not want to let Greece go because of the impacts that will have across Europe, and therefore I think a compromise will be reached. The second thing is that a technocratic government would be fantastic, because actually that's exactly what they should have done from the very beginning, like Monti in Italy, keep it for another year. They won't have elections until 2013. And
OK, a technocratic government, that's the answer.
The European Union was put in place to guarantee democracy in Europe. Look what's happening. Appointed governments all over the place. It won't solve the problem. 6% reduction in the size of the economy. I update my number from 12 to 14% now. I'm afraid it's going downhill very fast. There's only one way. You've got to cut the Gordian knot, accept the problem. It'll be painful, but less painful than 10 years of austerity, which is what the alternative is.
David Davis and Vicky Pryce, thank you very much. Now, the government